Live?
Yes.
It's working?
Yes.
Hey everybody. Sorry I'm a little bit late. I'm George Corser, Grad Connection. Thanks for coming tonight. I was kind of surprised this many people showed up and got started a little bit late. Before we get to the big event, I wanted to just go over a couple of things. First, what is Grad Connection? Grad Connection is a campus-wide graduate student association. And our purpose is to provide service to the university. You guys might not know this, but we want to be the most helpful student organization on campus. That's our goal. And we believe in scholarship first. We all want to get better degrees, better grades, better everything, better papers, everything else. Fellowship, which just means we want to be able to make some friends. People that we're going to know for the rest of our lives, the rest of our careers, instead of just walking by somebody and you know them, right? And the third one is stewardship. We want to be able to help the university even after we've left campus and help grow the university. Because as the Oakland University's reputation grows, all of our degrees become more valuable. So that, along with interdisciplinary collaboration, is kind of my own personal motivation for doing all this. So that's Grad Connection. The second thing is I want to introduce a couple of other very important guests here. Lindsay Pillow, can you please stand up? Can you get her, Todd? I don't know how well you can twist that thing. If you twist that thing, it does. You don't want to miss her. She's our faculty advisor. I guess she's not faculty, but she's our advisor. Yep. And so without her, the whole thing falls apart. So she was also the past president of this organization. So. Vice President, Grad or not, there he is. He's a very reliable guy, great guy to have. He's here too. And our treasurer, Debbie Berry. Look in there. We have a vacancy in our officer ranks. And unfortunately, the person just had to have classes, and that's going to happen from time to time. So the guy who was helping me with these things, who's parking my car right now, Jared. Everybody, let's elect him secretary, okay? Assuming he agrees. Okay, everybody who votes aye?
Aye.
Any nay? Nay? You want to put, we can have a runoff. I mean, I'm not going to railroad the election or anything, but yeah, okay. He's a really good, helpful guy, and we'll tell him he's elected when he comes back. Okay, now the next event too is going to be December 20th. That's going to be just a social event. We're going to try to get Rangoli food, from the Indian place down the street. So unless there's any other ideas, just email me with your ideas. And how many people are not going to be around December 20th? Most have. Well, some people are not going to be here. I mean, because there's no classes going on then.
Right.
So I don't know. Well, there'll just be more for us. Okay, and then that's it. Now, any other further ado? Let's go ahead and do this thing here. Today's presentation is academic publishing. I'm going to try to have speakers on how to get funding for your PhDs or for your master's degree. There's a lot of creative ways to do that. And I'm going to try to get somebody from the NSF and NIH to come. But we might not be able to pull it off by December 20th. I'm pretty sure we can pull it off, though, by February, so I'll let you know. And then, why we're all here is you guys. Dr. Mike Sevilla and Dr. Brad Roth, distinguished professor of physical chemistry, Mike Sevilla, and Department of Physics, Brad Roth. I met you at that Yes Expo, and he was getting little kids all excited about physics. So we have people who are able to handle many levels of academic ability here. As you probably, most of you know, I'm a doctoral candidate here in the computer science department. So I'm looking for people to collaborate with on information security projects. So if you get any brilliant ideas, look me up. Now for the main event, let's go ahead and just give you some ground rules here. We're going to go through some questions. Each one's going to be preceded by a little cartoon like Dr. Smith did last time. I thought that worked kind of nice. And then after they make their comments about the question, ask whatever you want. But we'll try to keep it to 5 minutes per question. So that will be 50 minutes total. If you want some coffee or anything, I mean, should we do that first, you think? I don't know. We'll let this thing go. We waited long enough. So they'll comment, and then you guys can ask questions, and then we'll just have a free-for-all at the end for however long we can stay. The camera on these guys, way to be done. Struggling scientists, please cite my pages. That starts us off. Why would anyone want to write an academic paper?
Okay. Why would you write an academic paper? Well, if you're seeking a career in academia, this is sort of the route to success, because your academic papers are your credentials in the field. They are how you make your mark as a scientist or an engineer or in academia. So your publications will, and the quality of the publications and where they're published, we'll talk more about where, are how you get promoted in a research-oriented institution. So they're critical to your career, and your choice of how you, where you publish, and your skills and developing ideas and so on are very critical to your career.
And if you do some fantastic, groundbreaking research and you don't tell anybody, it's like it never happened. So if you're the way scientists communicate with each other is primarily by publishing papers. They also go to meetings and they talk, but I think more of the archive, the standard way to communicate your ideas is to publish. So it's a way, not only does it benefit you, but it's essential for science. Otherwise, science isn't going to progress.
Is it possible to get a PhD without publishing any academic papers?
That depends on your institution. There are some institutions that require 3 publications. UCLA in chemistry, that's required. So that depends on the academic area and what the requirements are. Generally, if you haven't published an academic paper, that is a mark against you, and I don't know.
I agree. I lead the medical physics program, and we've had some cases where people have gotten their degrees without publishing any papers, but it usually means that wasn't a real successful case. We still gave them the degree, but it's not going to be good for them, and it's not good for us. It's an expectation. It's not a requirement, at least not in our program, but it is definitely a goal and an expectation.
Any questions on that one?
Questions?
It's pretty straightforward. Let's try the whole thing. Let's get into the nitty-gritty here. Most scientists regarded the new streamlined peer review process as quite an improvement. The last guy looks pretty nasty. Here, I got
That's the rejection.
that is an unpleasant way to get rejected. What is peer review?
Well, when you send a paper in to get published, the editor of the journal will typically send it to 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 1, but 2 is kind of typical people who are experts in the field to read it, make comments, and recommend whether it should be published or not. And you basically have to go through this in order to have your paper accepted. If the reviewers are very negative, the editor will very rarely overrule them. So peer review is a way of quality control in the sciences, and oftentimes when you're talking about your publications, you'll say, I was published in a peer-reviewed journal, and that means a lot more than saying you were published in some journal that just takes anything.
Right. And the peers that are reviewing the journal are your paper are people like you who have published in that journal, and it's a requirement, essentially, that if you're publishing, you will also be reviewing. And so the peer reviewers are not just those people. They're you're part of a scientific group that is reviewing each other's work. And so as you peer review, you learn about other people's work, but it's a requirement you not use that in your research until it's published. If you sorts of ways of having ethical violations in these processes, plagiarism and all sorts of things. So part of publication is to know the rules about the ethical requirements for each step in the process.
Usually the peer reviewers for most journals are anonymous. So you might be able to guess who they are, but you don't really know who they are. Most journals give the paper with your name on it. They don't try to hide who the author is. So usually the reviewer knows who you are, but you don't know who the reviewers are. There are exceptions, but I'd say 90% are that one.
Yeah, it's nearly always.
Yeah.
How many of you guys have peer reviewed as a reviewer? A couple of people.
It's, I've done a lot of peer reviewing, and it's a lot of work, and you don't get paid for it. But it's really a service that the scientists have to do. Otherwise, you might have more time, but the entire science infrastructure is going to fall apart if people aren't willing to do the peer review.
And journal editors are now finding more problems in getting reviewers for their papers, depending on the journal and so on. So there is a lot of time-consuming effort that goes into reviewing a paper. So it's an ethical obligation that if you publish, you have to review. I mean, there's nobody who's going to put handcuffs on you and lead you away, but it's something that a lot of science is done as a community effort, and so your publications are how you make your career and make your mark in science, but also what goes underneath is a group effort. When you go to meetings, you tend to want to share your information with others to create an environment where everybody's working together. At the same time, you know that you have to make your own advances. So there's a balance there that's has to be.
And editors for a journal usually know the people in the field, and they're going to pick out a couple of the people in the world who are really experts in your field to review your paper. So you've got to assume you're being reviewed by some of the most knowledgeable people in the field. It's very hard to BS your way through because these are going to be truly your peers and the experts.
Right. Now you may find, and this happens occasionally, that the reviewer that is picked happens to be somebody that you have offended in some way, or has a very critical view of you and your research, and may not give an unbiased review. And if you've had that experience and you know who it is, or you think that you know who it is, you could actually request when you submit the article that this reviewer should not be chosen. Now, I've noticed that on some journal, I just submitted a paper and it said, please list those you would like to have review your paper who are expert in the area, and those that you do not wish to have. So there was actually, that's the first time I've seen that, so that is interesting.
Is it a good idea if you're referencing the paper, and the same guy is peer reviewing the paper, right? Or your paper, and you're referencing his paper in your paper. Is it a good idea and if you're trying to improve his idea, is it a good idea to ask for him to review the paper?
I think for your benefit long term, it's always best to have the most expert people in the area review it. Getting your paper through without having expert review may seem like I got my paper published, I've done that. But what happens is you may miss something, you may have made a mistake. And long term, making mistakes in the literature does more harm to you. So getting the paper rejected may be doing you a favor long term, because you can go back, correct that, and then send it in. So getting the most expert people you can get to review your paper makes the science more solid and makes your career advantaged.
Yeah, I sometimes get a little annoyed when journals ask me for suggestions for reviewers, because it seems like the editor doesn't have that many jobs. That's the one that he should have, is to pick out the reviewer. So unless it's mandatory, I sometimes leave it blank. But I agree with your point. It's very useful to have a good review, even if it's painful.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Sorry, can you just choose the professor you had as the reviewer, or that's sort of not how
Actually,
they don't?
yeah, you can't have somebody from your own institution, and you can't, it's really considered unethical to have your former supervisor for the last few years, or a close collaborator.
Right.
So you really can't do that.
If you publish with somebody, they can't review your paper if it's a recent publication.
Yeah.
They have a number of years separation. Yeah. So part of the requirements is that it be an objective, unbiased, and they're not going to favor you because they know you. That's
Other questions about peer review?
This is basically just a conference thing. This is, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? What is the difference between a journal and a conference?
Well, a journal is a written and published, it is a printed version, and a conference is where you go and present spoken words. Now, that isn't quite that simple, because at a conference you have abstracts that are published, and but generally you're speaking at a conference, or you're presenting a poster at a conference. A poster is a 4 by 8 feet sometimes, or 4 by 4. Some of you have already presented posters probably for scientific meetings or meetings you've been at, and they're a way of, it's an increasing way of scientists presenting their research where they don't speak, because speaking slots take so much time, and each one gets 15, 20 minutes, and so if you go through a whole day of sitting there listening to 15 to 20 minute talks, you can get very blurry-eyed. So the poster came up as a way of people going through and looking at those that are of interest to them and speaking to a person in front of the poster. So you stand in front of your poster. So at a conference, that's basically what happens. You're either speaking or you're at a poster. And the journal is where you publish your papers.
Yeah, some people think posters sessions are sort of lower on the totem pole than a talk, but I find doing a poster is actually more useful, because you get to talk with people, it's more fun.
Right.
But it is a little bit of interesting thing in that you publish an abstract, and sometimes a conference will have a conference proceedings, and you might actually publish like a page paper. Now usually that doesn't preclude you from publishing then a full paper in a journal later. You can't really take the same data and publish it twice in a journal, but you can take stuff that you have presented at a conference and then publish the full version in a journal. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's highly recommended for the most part.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true, except for, go ahead.
Like, how long is it, like, is the waiting time if you publish the paper and then you send it out for a conference? Is there, I mean, if you send out a publication or a journal and you want it to go to this conference, but it's the same data that you're using,
Usually the conferences, you present at a conference and you publish later, yeah. Or you publish them at about the same time. There's no rules or regulations. If you published and then presented at a conference, that's sort of, they're getting, the conference is supposed to be up to date, what's happening now, and if you've already published it last year and you're presenting it, they may have read it and said, what is he doing here?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not really unethical. It's just a little backwards
Right.
and somewhat counterproductive as far as your time is concerned.
In in the computer science field, a lot of times the conferences are sought after things like MobiCom, things like this are hard, very exclusive. They are up to date because so many things in like smartphones and stuff are up to date.
Yeah. Some conferences are peer reviewed and only a small fraction of the abstracts get accepted. Some conferences are, most have some sort of peer review, but some will take 90% of the abstracts and some will take 20%. It really depends on the conference. You just have to kind of know the field.
There are, if you're a member of societies, the American Chemical Society, that I'm a member of, and a Radiation Research Society, you have a right to make a presentation, and the only requirement is that it's reviewed for, I would say that it isn't ridiculous, it doesn't have, it's not offensive, it is a scientific paper, and it fills that, then you can present it. That would be the weakest criteria,
Yeah.
because very few are thrown out in those societies. Being a member sort of gives you the right to do it.
I know there's a conference in magnetic resonance imaging, I don't remember exactly which one, where they take only like 20% of the abstract. So there's also the other extreme, and where it becomes very competitive, and it's a really honor to get in. So you just have to know the field. Questions? I have a quiet audience. Feel free to.
You mentioned something about being a member.
Yes.
That might help someone to get or to see that sort of importance. For example, if I join the IEEE
Right.
and I send my paper to them,
Yeah.
and I am a member,
Right.
so maybe you cannot give me consideration first before the non-member paper, and then review it first because I am a member.
So I don't know about the IEEE, but in other societies that definitely would be the case, that members would be given preference. Now, it depends on how the body is set up to review those, but becoming a member in societies is usually, has several levels. There are student memberships, and they very much encourage students to present posters, and some have student presentation sessions. So being a member at that level also allows you to get started early in your presentations.
I don't think that's true for publications. Like if you tried to publish a paper in the IEEE Transactions of Biomedical Engineering, say, I don't think being a member gives you much, if any, advantage when it comes to peer review. So it's a little bit different between a paper and a conference. And speaking of memberships, one thing you should all be thinking about perhaps becoming members of is Sigma Xi. We have it's an honor society for all of sciences. We have a chapter right here at OU. It's a way you can get started, and it's really, I think it's a great society. So yes.
That brings me to a question. I'm always floating on just determining whether I'm in humanities or sciences.
Okay.
Linguistics, is that a science? Is that something that could be part of that?
Well, Sigma Xi is very broad. I usually think of linguistics as more humanities,
Yeah.
but that's not to say you couldn't become a member.
Okay.
It's a hard question.
Yeah. The other question I was going to ask is, you mentioned posters, and I haven't heard about those for conferences before. What's the situation with those? Is that,
You mean how are they?
how are they put to, what are they?
They are, physically, the way to make them is you get a PowerPoint slide, you put the dimensions as 4 feet by 4 feet or whatever the conference requires, and then you put the elements of a presentation on it, a title, the authors and affiliations, abstract, material,
As
methods.
if you were presenting it in a class or...
Right, exactly. And you put it all in nice columns with pictures and descriptive elements and conclusions. And then people come by and ask questions. Well, they don't have to read the whole thing there. They may just be interested in the title and look at your first figure and say, well, gee, that's very interesting, could you explain that? And
Okay.
so,
There is a printer over in the print shop
Huh.
where you can get them printed up, but it costs a little bit. What, $100, $80?
yeah, it's
Something
something
like
like
that.
100.
And I have occasionally kind of cheap, I'm a cheap guy, and printed them up and made them
little
sort
pieces.
in little pieces and
Right.
tacked them up, and it looks a little tacky,
Tacky.
I have to admit.
Now that actually they have a new way of printing them. Before they print them on really a sheet of paper that you had to roll up because it was a glossy sheet, and if you folded it, it crinkled, and so it had to be rolled and put in a tube. And you'd go, if you've ever been on an airplane, you saw somebody
Yeah.
stick this big 4-foot-long tube in there. They were going to a conference somewhere. Okay, now they have paper that is cloth-like paper. You can just fold it and put it in your bags and carry it with you. Nobody will know you're going to a conference. Yes.
What's more important in terms of publishing, quantity or quality? Is better to have too many okay papers or a few just superb, excellent papers?
Go ahead.
I would say probably quality, but you don't want to just totally ignore quantity. But I think if you have some, just a handful of papers, but they're highly cited, they're really making an impact in the field, you're probably better off than having 100 so-so papers. So you don't want to just have one paper and have that, modestly important, but ignore quantity. But I would say in the end, quality is going to win.
I would agree with that. Except maybe in where people can't judge the quality of your work. So if you're at an institution which is counting them,
Yeah.
they will use metrics which are not really true metrics. They will use metrics such as the impact factor that we'll talk about later of the journal, and things of that sort have nothing really to do with the quality of your paper. And so they're mixed, but for your scientific reputation or your reputation in your field, having the quality paper is going to give you a lot better reputation than having lots of low quality papers. And
Or
if-
even mediocre quality. I mean, I don't mean like low quality,
Yeah.
but mediocre quality.
if you're
Marketing product.
if you're making progress and you're doing things that is sort of workman-like, but still people respect it, and you're doing a lot of that, that's going to get respect. There are people who are really brilliant people. They make Einstein, for example. I don't think he had that many publications, but everybody here knows his name and who he was because the publications he had were absolutely phenomenal. He broke a new world for us. Right? So there are very few people who can do that. And so in science, most of us are more in the workman category. We're tinkering and we're breaking through the frontiers of science because you're working, when you're doing science or into this type of work where you're trying to break through into new knowledge, you really don't know what you're doing in some sense. And building that front outward is you're laying the foundation for others to come along. So that gets respected.
A little bit harder question is whether you should publish a long paper or several short ones, putting equality aside, because in some ways a long paper is nice, but if you spend 4 years and then you get one long paper, you might be better off publishing 2 or 3 shorter ones. They're still good. Now some people try to go what's called the least publishable unit, where they break them up into 20 papers and each one has a tiny increment. I mean, that's not probably a good idea, but getting the length versus quantity is a tougher decision. Getting quality, I think, is pretty clear. You want above quantity.
Right. I agree with that. I have a colleague who divided his work into each molecule. He would have another paper that he developed, and it became obvious that he was being lazy in a sense, and so he lost some credibility that way. But publishing a long paper is not a good thing in a number of ways today. Your audience has less of a retention. They're not going to read long papers by and large now. There are too many competing sources. So focusing your paper to showing an excellent point where you state what you're going to do, you state the problem first in the literature, and then you do something that is that you set a new piece of information out, a new way of understanding, and it's all collected in this one source as one publication. Gets you a lot of attention to that problem because the audience can understand it quickly, and if you have another discovery that you want to make, putting it in with that will just lose it. So if you have multiple things that you've discovered, sometimes it's best to present them separately so the ideas get out there into the arena instead of one getting lost.
What would you define as long or moderate length, roughly?
In the journal, it depends on the journal. Some journals that publish sort of communications and things, 4 pages would be typical length. If you start going up above 10 or 12 pages, I think you got yourself a long paper.
Double column? or-
No, this is in the journal.
Okay.
It's going to be longer than that when you submit the thing double spaced with all the figures and everything. But but in the journal, if it's going more than about 12 pages, you probably have yourself a pretty long paper.
Right.
It varies. It's just a rule of thumb.
I know on the conferences, naturally this world is organized. For example, the department, the schools, everything rank. And at conference, if somebody said, oh, there is a speaker from Harvard or Yale, you're going to expect somebody that's going to have very good topic. Or maybe a publisher also going to have the same content. My question is, does the school ranking, department ranking will affect my paper somehow, even though it may be good paper, but the department somehow, or the school ranking somehow, kind of as good as the other papers?
Well, actually, I think you'll find that yes and no. Good work will get published, okay, wherever it's from, because the peer reviewers generally know their business, and they will recognize it as good work, and it really doesn't matter where it came from. However, there's always an innate prejudice in some people about work from other institutions, and there is a pecking order that, as you just pointed out. So that can get in the mix, but in general, I'd say if you have good work, it's going to get published. And I think it might not get published in the top journal because the pecking order does work a little bit. I don't know if you
I think so. I think the same people who are doing the bean counting that you mentioned earlier are doing the pecking order.
Yeah.
The experts in the field are going to appreciate
Good
the
work.
good work. So probably short term, I think that can have an impact. But I think long term, it doesn't have too much of an impact.
I want to bring this question to a close because we have 10 questions and time is, this is a great topic. We could probably have more of these. But I think there is one question that's important enough to talk about before we leave the topic, which is the cost. I'm going to a conference first week of December. The fee's $960. And of course there's a plane flight and everything else. Now I published a journal paper earlier this year, nothing. One of the journals I was going to submit to said, "You please send us the voluntary optional fee, page fee, $100 per page." That's what they said. I'm not going to send you the fee. I don't have that kind of money. But the university, I managed to find some funding. They paid for my travel. That was cool. But but it's a lot of money for a conference and a journal, but the journal's better, right? And it's free, right?
There's a reason to go to a conference different than a journal. At a conference, you meet people, you talk to them, you make your way within the field, you build your credibility with your peers as a person. And so if and this is very critical if you're working toward getting funding, getting support from fund agencies, the National Science Foundation or other, could be the Department of Energy or whatever it is. Those people who you're talking to will also be reviewers on grants and publications and so on. And if you establish a credibility with them there, and they see who you are and they've talked to you and they see you're credible, that gives you a leg up in all of those cases. So it's actually, you probably can't be very successful if you don't go to conferences and present your work and make yourself known to the scientific world.
Especially when you're younger and
Yeah.
you're building a career. I probably don't travel as much as I should, and my career has probably been hurt marginally by that. But as far as cost of journal publication, it depends on the journal. Some of the open access journals will charge you a couple thousand to publish, and then anybody can access the paper. A lot of the other journals that require subscriptions, there's no page charges, and so it's gotten more confusing over the last few years because of that. I never pay the voluntary fees. No, it's the truth.
Well,
Nor do I.
there's so much to discuss in this topic, and I'd hate to leave it, but we gotta press on. because,
Okay,
you know,
Let's move on.
This one says, has an attorney saying, then you struck the intruder with a bound PhD thesis? And the defendant says, yes, it was research with impact. What is impact factor? You mentioned it already. What is impact factor?
Impact factor is just how many times a particular journal gets articles that it published cited by others, authors. So you just take the number of articles they've published and you take the number of citations those articles received in the subsequent years. You put A over B and you've got the impact factor. Say an impact factor of 5 would mean average 5 citations in a period of time after the publication. And so impact factors of 30 is for something like Science or Nature, and 30, 40 maybe. And then impact factors in 3 and 4 are good journals that are not magazines. They are just solid science journals. And then some 5 to not 10 are those who are trying to make, I would say, who are higher quality or higher visibility journals.
There's a lot of journals out there that might have an impact factor of 1 or 2. And what that means is that the typical paper in that journal only has 1 or 2 citations over the last 2 or 3 years, which is a little bit sad in a way.
Yeah.
But
And that's
But, you know,
citations per paper
per
published.
paper, yeah,
Right.
because they divide out by the number of papers. So, the typical paper only has a handful of citations. It's just the way it works out. I mean, you want to publish highly cited work. Yeah.
I think it also depends on the subject. Like in computer science, for example, you find a lot of top journals with 1 or less impact factor. So I think, and they are ranked very high as very high journals. You
Yeah.
agree, George?
No, it's probably more like 2.
Well,
Probably less than 1
but
is
not
good.
5 or
That's
6.
not
Yeah.
That's not good. No, not 5 or 6.
Yeah.
It's pretty rare.
Okay.
Because there's so many different sub-areas.
Right.
How many times?
Yeah,
can you
it
say?
does depend on the area. Very strong in chemistry, that's a little lower. And if you go to biology and some medical areas, you get much higher citations.
Science and Nature are the 2 that I've never published in either one. I've always wanted to, and I feel kind of bad that I haven't broken into Science or Nature. But those are 2 really high impact journals that if you have something that's of wide interest, it would be a great place to try. And the good thing about Science and Nature is they'll usually tell you no very quickly. So you won't submit it and find out a no. You might submit it and find out a no 3 months later, but usually they'll tell you no within a week or two. So sometimes it's worth a try.
Yeah, the editor decides, yeah.
And does every different countries or like continents have different impact For example, are the impact factors in the U.S. different from Europe? And
No,
so they're it's all the same.
generally science is international. All these journals publish articles from anywhere in the world.
Now, there might be Chinese journals or Russian journals I don't know about. They're not English language journals, but most English language journals are international, and they're all, it's a global market, so to speak. And the other thing besides impact factor is you can judge individual papers and to some extent individual researchers by looking at their citation rates, and all that information is in a database called the Web of Science, which OU has a subscription to, and you can get through the OU library. So it's a great way, first of all, to find out where the high impact papers are, and it's also a great way to search for papers on a topic you're working on. You want to find out not just some papers, but the big impact papers in your topic. You can do keyword searches and sort by number of citations. So I spend more time sort of when I'm thinking about citation rates of papers and to people than I usually do about impact factors in journals.
What if you cite your own paper?
You know, people do all the time, and sometimes in the Web of Science you can actually click a button that will remove self-citations.
Yeah.
It's a little bit bad form to cite yourself excessively, but usually in a journal that blocks out the name of the author, you can usually figure out the author by looking at the references, and whoever's cited the most is typically the author.
Right, and that isn't as negative as it sounds, because people who are publishing in an area are usually creating part of that area, and their back work really has to be cited. So I'm a guilty of citing myself.
I'm guilty too. I think we virtually all are.
And I agree with going to the Web of Science. If you want to know what some person is doing in the field, just put their name and the author link, and if it's Smith, of course, you're going to get thousands of people. So if you know what university there's a way of just looking at Smith at the university, and you could then find out what they've done for the last 30 years, essentially. It goes way back.
Like it or not, your potential employers, your potential tenure committee reviews, they're all going to be looking at citation rates. And you know, they're not the perfect metric, but they're one that's widely used, and at least it's quantitative. So you kind of best expect it.
My advisor told me 10 citations is the same as writing one paper. For her opinion, that's okay. We'll move right along.
I once had a friend who told me in the long run over your whole career, each citation was worth $1,000.
Oh, really? Wow.
In that case, I'm going to self-cite. Origin of feces. How do you write an academic paper? Where do you start? How do you get an idea? When you're just thinking about, well, I need to write a paper, publish or perish, right? How do you write a paper?
It's too late if you've read that stage. This papers don't come out of, usually, Einstein actually sat there at a patent office and did exactly that. Maybe I'll just do this. But usually it comes out of something you're doing actively in a laboratory or in some sort of environment which is generating your interest and so on. And from that you gain ideas. So there has to be something you're actively pursuing. And once you question that and get results, and if you see something new that is, one of the criteria of doing this, if you're working in an area, is to know the literature in that area. Because I found myself doing this too often. I go in the lab and I do something I think is, oh, this is a breakthrough. I'm going to be famous. And then I do the literature search and find out it was done 20 years ago, right? So in a way, it's fulfilling to know that you're as smart as those people were back then, but it doesn't do you a bit of good to repeat in the laboratory what's been done 20 years ago. As a matter of fact, you try to publish that, your name is mud, right? As a matter of fact, there are people who do that, make that mistake, and the first thing that a reviewer does, if they're familiar with the field, is to say, this was published, long ago. This person has not even read the literature in the area. That's a good way to get yourself rejected. So the first thing you've got to do before you write the paper is do the literature search and get the idea.
When I was a new graduate student, I was a little bit confident. I told my thesis advisor, I says, I want to do my dissertation on something that's my own idea. Don't give me a project. I want to do my own idea. Well, that didn't happen. And it almost never happens. So usually, as far from the point of view of a student, you're usually working with a mentor who has a track record and has an ongoing research project. If you could go in and just out of the blue as a student come up with publishable dissertation ideas, you're really ahead of the game. So don't feel too bad. You want to eventually develop that skill. You have to if you're going to make it in academia. But if you don't have it as a new graduate student, don't get worried too much.
Yeah, nobody does.
Nobody does.
All right, now this is where the rubber meets the road here. These are the pieces of a research paper, and this is the one that was.
Those are the details, but we can go back to yours.
well, I'm just. We can either say for the. I'm going to go to the next question, and then we'll go back. This isn't very funny or anything, but what's included in an academic paper? So let's go through these. Do you want one of these like laser things?
Well, no, we can just point here. We're close. Now everybody's probably seen an academic paper of sorts of any journal pretty much follows this script. You have the title and the authors and their affiliations, but each of these have their own little rules and regulations about, for example, the authors. Who's first is usually the person who gets the most credit for it. And the research advisor, if you're in a group where you're the student and the research advisor is the person who is directing the research, that person usually is the last author in the field I'm in. But that's not always true.
It's the way it is in physics, but for instance in math, they usually publish in alphabetical order. And I don't know about other fields I'm really not that familiar with, but in the sciences, it's usually just as you say. First authors usually, oftentimes the paper is cited as Sevilla et al. And so you really want to be Sevilla and not be one of the et al.
But if you're the research advisor, as I am, there are no Sevilla et al.
Well, there used to be, I'm sure.
So it's the student who does the research work who gets the person who does the actual work, who wrote the thesis, if it's a thesis project, that's the first author, and that's usually the case anyway. Then the affiliation, say that you wrote your thesis, the paper's published, but you're no longer at Oakland University, you're over in U of M, say, or something. The paper that comes out of Oakland University has Oakland University as the affiliation, and your new address is put as a subscript. So the affiliation is where you did the work, not where you are. Okay. And then the abstracts, it depends on the length, depends on the journal rules, but it's 200 to 300 words usually. And it's a summary of the purpose, the major findings, and its significance, and very short.
It's not an introduction, it is a summary.
Right. And then the introduction has to present that background to what you are about. What in the literature gave you the basis for doing the project? And what's the problem with the literature you are trying to solve? Because the literature sets the base for what is known, and you're trying to now change that. And what are you changing? That the literature, is the literature wrong? Is there a conundrum in the literature that you're trying to solve? That's where you that's where you can lose the interest of your readers if you don't set out a problem that is of any interest to them. As a matter of fact, you will lose the interest in the title because it may be a topic that the reader's not interested in, and that's the purpose of the title, is to set the topic for those who are interested in that area. So you want in the title enough to get the basic concept of what you're dealing with. And then in the introduction, we've just talked about methods and material. Go
Let me
ahead.
just mention a couple
Yeah.
things about the introduction. First of all, there's usually a lot of citations to the literature in the introduction,
Right.
more than almost any other place in the paper. And you'll often have an introduction that might be 3 or 4 paragraphs, and it'll be like this. It'll be paragraph 1, 2, 3, it'll be a whole lot of discussion about the background, a lot of citations. And then the last paragraph of the introduction will often begin, so our goal is, and then you'll state your hypothesis and what your overall goal is, and then you go to the methods. That's a very typical structure.
Yes, I have a question about what you just said about the introduction. You say that in the introduction you could put some citations that are relevant to the concept you're introducing, correct? But one of the papers that I wrote, one of their comments was that they didn't like the way I put some of the references. Actually, they didn't like me putting the references in the introduction section. They just said all the references should be in the related work. So I was kind of struck because some of the things that I was introducing, I was trying to reference some previous work that had been done. And so therefore I had to give Caesar what belongs to Caesar in the intersection. But here now they come and say that, you know, you can't put citations in the intersection. So
If I can, in computer science, they usually will have a separate section for background and related work.
I
And it's a big issue whether you put it at the beginning of the paper or the end of the paper, but it's really, that's a computer science thing.
Okay.
So it's not really,
Oh.
the same principle applies. In that section,
Yeah.
we have all of our citations, practically the whole paper.
So
We would break it up into 2 pieces, because,
the introduction is broken into.
you can't explain all the details. Sometimes you put it at the end because,
Oh, really?
well, you don't know if the reader knows what the field that well.
Okay.
The reviewer could be wireless communications, but there's a lot of stuff, to know.
Oh, yes.
So I read that review and they didn't like it. No, somebody's not gonna like everything, but the principle is the same. You said that if we include introduction and related work and background in the same piece, and you wanna make it short enough that you don't lose the reader,
Correct.
right, which was the guy's point in your review, and, but it's gotta make sure that you're building on somebody else's work. You can't just be making up your own idea and say, I think this is brilliant. It's a balancing act.
Right, it is. Yeah, you can't cite everything in your introduction. Introductions are often a couple of pages at the most.
Yeah.
Sometimes, really good papers can have introductions of only a couple of paragraphs because the problem is set out very clearly and the literature is only a few papers that are relevant. And if that's the case, there's no reason to extend it. That would be fine.
Let me put one more thing is that most journals will have instructions for authors that will lay all this out in detail,
Correct.
so that you don't have to kind of guess.
Absolutely.
So the first thing, if you decide on a journal, the first thing to do is read their instructions for
Right.
authors.
Because journals don't always have these in exactly this order. Some will put materials and methods at the end.
Yeah, I hate that.
Yeah, okay. And
So, just to follow up on that question, so in the intersection, also there's, now, I mean, people are not agree on what to put there. For example, in the intersection, some advisors say, put almost every, I mean, summarize almost everything in the intersection including probably part of the results, so that when the reviewer reviews the paper, from the intro section, he has a clear idea of what he's going to be doing. But other scholars say that, there's no need for you to put, at least to summarize the results in the intro. Because in the intro, you said, this is what I'm doing, this is what has been done, and I'm going to show that my research and my experiment has produced certain results. So you want to summarize those results in the intro. But some scholars say it's not appropriate. So there's a great area there that I'd like you to elaborate on.
My preference is to not put any results in the introduction, but the abstract should have had a brief statement of your main results. So they already should have seen it if they read the abstract, but I never put results in my introduction.
I sometimes do what you do. So here are two people who are publishing. I will set the problem out and I'll say we've solved it in this way in I will say a single sentence or so that lets them know where you're going.
Maybe a single sentence, yeah.
You prefer to have the abstract do that, and that's fine. That's fine.
All right, let's move on back.
Yeah, go ahead. You know about this.
I got a question about that. Like, going to the point of how much background you want to put in. Sometimes you find the reviewers, and I know you have to please the reviewers to get your stuff published. They will ask you questions like, you need to refer stuff that's like, if you're sending it to a journal that's already very close to what you do, and everybody knows, whoever's reading the paper already knows what is the basics behind it. Like, how much background do you need to put in? Like, I mean, if I'm doing MRI and cartilage, like, explaining magic angle, everybody knows what magic angle is, but if the reviewer is asking, explain this, but it's like an addition paragraph
Well,
explaining this stuff.
sometimes you have to add stuff to please reviewers, but we'll come back to that. I usually would not put in too much details. I would say the main things, I would cite references where they can go to get the details, unless it's something that's absolutely crucial to my whole point. And if they don't get that piece of background, then I might give it a few sentences. But I don't go off on a several paragraph digression.
You just can't do that. And there are review articles and something like Magic Angle that's in the literature. It's in textbooks.
Yeah.
You would never have to really describe that in detail unless it's an educational.
So I submit the paper and then got a review, and then the one reviewer has a really good point and a really short paragraph, so I don't need too much revise. But the other reviewer give a list of questions, and then he asked almost every single thing, even I cited. He or she, I don't know exactly. The reviewer want me to explain things, even I cite the paper. In that case, should I put the short paragraph for the reviewer?
And some reviewers can cause your paper to look like it's been just cut up to pieces. And you want to avoid that. You can't let the reviewer take your paper over and make it disjointed and so on. So what you would do is answer their questions and take what you can from the reviewer, as long as the paper maintains its integrity in terms of improving your work. But don't let reviewers make your paper into something you had no plans to have it, unless it's an improvement, okay? So you can fight back against reviewers without being combative. You can say, yes, you can answer their question, but not in your paper, okay? That's one way to treat it. You answer their question fully. If they are making a point that you could answer, you can just say, yes, that's true. And it's covered in reference 22, so we didn't see why we should put it in our paper.
Yeah, I tend to be a little bit more towards just trying to do what the reviewer wants, gets to satisfy the guy or woman, whoever. But it's a balancing act, and oftentimes you want to try to address their point in your paper, but do it as briefly as possible. And don't go off on some big digression. If they want you to cite a couple papers, we'll cite the papers and move on. Or if they want you to describe something, add a sentence and describe it. But don't let them take it over.
Right.
And don't let them ever put mistakes into your paper.
Absolutely. I agree with this, but I think she was describing a certain, that's exactly what I do. I mean, if they're asking you to make minor changes and they're reasonable and it makes the paper look better, there's nothing wrong with that. But if they're going through every sentence of your paper and they're causing you to change wording or meanings and so on, there comes to be a point where you can't. But I advise exactly what Dr. Ross said, be tolerant to your reviewer because they hold your paper in their hands. But don't let them ruin your paper, right? Okay.
Let's move on to the next topic, just so that there's time, I think.
Can
Yeah.
I ask, sorry, one
Sure,
last
go ahead.
question? Sometimes I see when you're submitting, so you're just submitting into the website to a specific journal, and it asks you there for the summary also. So it asks you to add a little summary for a few lines. I don't
Down
exactly, yeah, I didn't exactly, I don't know what exactly they mean by that. You have sort of a summary in the abstract because you're explaining.
I usually cut and paste the abstract and stick it there.
So that's okay to do that?
Well, it depends a little bit. You ought to read the instructions of the journal. If they specifically say the summary's different and that the summary has a different purpose, then I guess you got to write something up. But if they just want a summary, to me, that's the abstract.
The only thing that the summary would not have is the purpose out of the abstract. Usually you give some purpose or something in the abstract of why you did the work. Summary is the major features of your findings. So it would be a little, that's the way I would view it. And so conclusions are a little bit different than a summary. Sometimes people write summary and conclusions. They summarize what they're doing and then but that's all, can all be part of the discussion. So there are a lot of papers that have no conclusion, no summary section. They just have the discussion and it ends, but the last couple of paragraphs are the purpose of summary and conclusions.
Yeah, I've had reviewers tell me to cut the conclusion section right out. This paper's too long. And in some ways, that's not a problem. It sometimes reads just fine without the conclusion section. As long as you said the conclusions, leave your discussion and the results. Is there anything else you want to say? Let me just note that when I'm writing a paper, I usually, when I sit down in front of the blank screen, the first thing I write is the methods. Because that's something, you know what you did. I mean, just describing what you did, you know that. It's real easy to write. Then you usually write the results, which consists of mainly figures and citations to figures. And then, once I've gotten those down, I'll go back and I'll work on the introduction and discussion. That's how I do it.
Yeah. And everybody does it differently. I create the figures and tables, and then, because I find that's what the paper's about, and then I sort of, everything else comes out from that. Yeah. And so the methods would be the next thing I would do. But you don't start with the introduction, because actually, if you haven't really written the results section yet, you don't know, you haven't really thought it all through. And you'd be surprised when you're writing your paper how much insight you get into the results you should have been thinking about in this way. I often end up going back in the lab and saying, why didn't I do this before? It's obvious I should have, but you didn't think about it until you started writing it up. So I'm in a feedback loop with the results section for a while. So the introduction comes later, and that's pretty much the way.
my
This one says, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. And in the chalkboard it says, then a miracle occurs. What makes one paper better than another?
Well, first of all, its importance. If you have a really important research finding, it's generally going to be a better paper. And the other thing is that is your writing. I can't stress enough how I think it's important for scientists to be able to write, because I've reviewed a lot of papers, and I hate to say it, but a lot of papers coming from non-native English speakers who really don't have the English quality, and you can take a great science idea and you can ruin it by writing it very poorly.
Right.
So I think those are the two things. The quality of the research idea still has to be absolutely #1 priority, but then write it well in clear English is really important too.
May I address that real quickly? I work in the Writing Center.
Okay.
Anyone at OU, there is no excuse for having an ESL problem with your paper.
Okay.
Because every person here has the opportunity to get that fixed. You just have to come take the opportunity.
And we're very lucky in the United States because the language of science is our native language. And I feel bad for people who have to write their science in a non-native language, but it's just the way it is. So you just got to learn to deal with it. Sorry.
Yeah, the clarity of your exposition will make or break your paper. You can take a great finding and hide it with unclear, ambiguous language. And so I second that strongly.
Some students want to go into science because they don't like to write, and that's a big mistake.
You bet.
If you don't mind my making a comment, my wife is from South Korea, and she's always trying to improve her writing on her job. And I find it even in the department here too, but if you do subject, verb, object, it becomes remarkably clear. My advisor's Chinese, and her papers are great. Dr. Shu's is outstanding because he thinks clearly and he writes clearly. But the writing can't be, you can't avoid it. It has to be there.
Yes.
I don't mind if somebody forgets to put the right article in there, but I do mind if I don't know what the object of the sentence is. Right?
Or it's confused and repeated, and the paragraph doesn't hold together logically. It's got to be a clear presentation. And science is not literature, and you actually have to force yourself to write in short declarative sentences, so you don't make sentences that have ands and lots of wherebys and so on. It's not legal language that you're trying to hide something. Some scientists write that way because they're trying to hide something. So if you see a scientific paper that says, well, what did that mean? It probably means that they didn't know what they were talking about. Right? So you could assume that. If it's clearly stated, unambiguously, then it's a good science statement. Okay. If it's unclear, it means the author's unclear about it, or they don't have the proper English.
My motto is it has to be, first of all, correct, then it has to be clear, and in third place is concise, because you've got to write, you can't expect people to be reading long tomes. You've got to write briefly and in a short way, but still clear.
Okay. So the importance and the clarity. All right, the next one is, we love all the words in your manuscript, but we were wondering if you could maybe put them in a completely different order. That's a review process, right? What happens in the revision process when you revise your paper?
Well, I find,
We've talked about it a little bit.
yeah, we've talked about this, but I think what I have found over the years is that the reviewers who give you the negative reviews, when they find a flaw, often are your best friends, they're giving you a real boost because they're not allowing you to publish something that could be wrong, or it's it's a little mistaken or whatever, however your feelings are hurt, you can call it whatever you like, but they are directing you to go somewhere else with that paper outside, so it is truer than where it was. And if you see that that's really true, that you've made some sort of logical error, or you didn't do the critical control experiment, or whatever, you don't get angry at the reviewer, you thank them, because they have saved you from poor work, and now your work, when completed, is going, maybe it's going to take you that extra 6 months to do the work or whatever. Yes, and we're all human. We know that 6 months requires, maybe you don't take that vacation or whatever it is, but the work that comes out is scientifically better. And for your career, that's an improvement. So what happens in the revision process? Improved papers, if you're lucky, right?
And the review process, reviewers can take various lengths of time, but I think like 2 months is kind of typical. And usually you have to revise it once, but it's not too uncommon to have to revise it a couple times, or even a third time. If you start getting more than that, usually the editor is just going to give up and reject it. But it is, I agree with you. You have to have a thick skin about it. You have to, you get the review and you read it, then go home and kind of do whatever you do to relieve stress, play racquetball or something, and then go back the next day and start making the changes.
A glass of wine.
Yeah.
Okay. This one is scientists.
We got a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry. Isn't it a good idea that if you do send the paper in and you're rejected, but of course you get comments of the reviewers, is it a good idea to submit it again to the same journal or not?
Actually, I've been through a process like that, and my paper was rejected for a incorrect reason. Now, the journal that I sent it to, I explained it to the editor, and he said, well, both reviewers rejected your paper. Our journal policy is that you cannot resubmit that paper. So I said, well, they're both wrong, and I'm going to change the title, and I'm going to do this work to show they're wrong, and I'm going to resubmit it under a new title. Would you accept it? And he said, yes, I would.
What do you mean, would you review it again?
Would they would they accept it as a paper for review?
Yeah, not accepted.
And I said, please send it to the same reviewers.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
Because I wanted to show that how wrong they were. So it got accepted.
All right. There you go.
So
But,
reviewers can be wrong as well as right. Yeah.
But it's you better be right when you do it. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're not sure and you just kind of wanted to be stubborn, maybe it isn't a good idea.
No,
But if
no,
you really know that there was a mistake and you can show it,
Right.
then you could give it a try.
Yeah, for the most cases, the best thing to do is just take the paper, correct what you can, and send it to another journal. Okay, because, and you have to realize that other journal may send it to the same reviewers, so you do really need to pay attention to what they say.
I've had papers sent to me to review from different journals, the same paper, and
Right.
you keep sending it to me. They think I'm appropriate, and so I know that's got to be happening to my own papers too.
Right. And if you've already rejected it,
Yeah.
you can't change your mind.
Right.
Right. If nothing has changed. Generally, authors make a serious attempt to correct. Although you find some that are hard-headed and don't.
How do you know, like, if the reviewer, like, if it's a second time reviewer and you're like, okay, I'm trying to make my point and you've done the best you can, like, what's the point where you know, like, okay, I'm gonna send it somewhere else? Like, there's no point arguing with these reviewers, or you're not gonna get the paper published.
You start arguing the same things over and over with the reviewer. That's really a bad sign.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's where you call the editor
Yeah.
and you say, we are at an impasse. I'm pretty sure I'm right here. They sometimes send it to a third reviewer to make a judgment call between the two, and that's one way they can do it. And sometimes the editor will read it themselves and say, no, I believe you're correct, and actually publish your paper without going further. So, the most often would be a third reviewer.
I have a question. Can you send the same paper to different journals at the same time to increase your chance?
That's
of
considered
getting
unethical.
published?
That's really considered bad form. I don't know what punishment there would be if you were caught, but it's usually considered wrong to be, because they're going to send it out to reviewers, and that means you're going to be, instead of having 2 people have to review paper, you're going to have 2 people reviewing it and 2 people wasting their time. So, that really wouldn't be good form. I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah, every journal I know about makes you sign a statement it hasn't been sent anywhere else. This is the only place. Because they have a copyright form that you have to sign. That, so they get the copyright as soon as you submit it, essentially. So it would be, you would be violating that. You could be sued, actually. So
But if you translate it from English to Chinese,
to what?
what if you translate it, one in English here and one in Chinese, send this there and this here?
Are you saying would you be caught or would it be ethical? There might be different answers. Right?
I don't think it'd be ethical.
Right.
If you
Wouldn't
were-
be ethical,
yeah.
but you might not be caught.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
So make sure I understand this. So if you write a paper and you submit it and it gets rejected with revisions, you correct the, you can't submit it back to the same journal, or
If
you
it's
can?
rejected, fine, and you get a letter from the editor of the journal that your paper is rejected by that journal, they will not accept it back. Okay? That is the usual policy. That now, if you can argue, you can discuss that with the editor and say, well, I'm going to make these revisions and resubmit it. Can I do that? You can discuss that with them, and they will say yes often. However, the most common thing is that you take that paper, revise it, and send it to another journal. That's the usual practice.
And the usual response from a journal, in my experience, is maybe 5% of them will just accept my paper off the bat, 5 will totally reject it, and 90% will say revise and resubmit. And that, of course, you then revise and resubmit almost in every case. So it's kind of rare that you're being rejected outright without a chance to revise. But if they do say you rejected outright, my general inclination would be go find someplace greener pastures.
Well, there's some journals that you mentioned, Nature and so on, that actually do an editorial cull.
Yeah.
And what that means is they select papers only that they think will be high-impact papers, and they don't really send it out for review. The editor just sends your paper is not really suitable for our magazine, essentially, because they're looking for something that is flashy and people will get. And Nature and Science have both made tremendous mistakes because they're looking for that flashy, big story, and they publish things like polywater or they had a cold fusion one. Yeah, well, they didn't publish the cold fusion, but they did. There's this fellow called Teriyaki who did bubble fusion, and that was on the Science magazine's cover. Right, and it was not fusion, and it was just a little bubble with a little light coming out of it. But it was sexy, flashy, and so people, it's fusion in a little bit of water. So I really don't think that scientifically it is such a big advantage